Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth were the first Europeans to cross the Blue Mountains in 1813. Or were they? Well, 11 years before Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth took their first step west, a young French bloke, employed by the English and under the instructions of Governor King, launched his expeditions to cross the famous Blue Mountains. This is as far as he got on his first attempt. On the second attempt, he met with the same harsh and daunting terrain. And of course, he didn't travel alone.
Le gouverneur ayant approuvé la proposition que je lui
The governor having approved of the proposition I had made to him of going to explore the interior of the country and of trying to penetrate as far into the Blue Mountains as I should find it practical, I went to assure myself of what would be the best route. From Parramatta, I went to Prospect Hill with my party. I found at that rendezvous one of the natives of the cow pastures named Gogi, whom I had engaged to accompany me. This aboriginal had taken a fancy to me on my first journey, and I was interested in preserving his confidence by my good treatment, thinking it would be useful to me when I advanced further inland.
Francis Borrelia was the first early explorer who respected and interacted on a friendly basis with the Aboriginal people. In fact, he is the only one who met the mountain people at close quarters and whose journals recorded in such detail the lifestyles of the local Aboriginal people. This is in stark contrast to Blaxland, who said,
"The natives proved but of little use, which determined me not to take them again on my next distant expedition."
Francis Louis Borrelia came to Australia barely in his 20s. His family was French aristocracy fleeing the French Revolution. Young Francis, or maybe I should call him Frank, he was a clever young bloke. He was good at drawing maps, and like a lot of young people today, he was keen for a bit of adventure. So he set out getting permission off the governor of the colony, Governor King, to find out what was beyond the Blue Mountains. The problem was, though, Borrelia was an ensign in the New South Wales Army Corps, the notorious Rum Corps. The Duke of York had expressly forbidden officers of the regiment from exploring the mountains. You see, their job was to keep the convicts in check. So to get around this order, Governor King claimed Borrelia as his aide-de-camp and sent him as an ambassador to meet the King of the Mountain. The Great Dividing Range crosses 3 states along the east coast of Australia, from Queensland to Victoria. A 2,000 kilometre stretch of rugged, beautiful and at times formidable country. This is the track that Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth took. And this is the way that Borrelia went. Brave fella. It's hard to believe, but just 96 kilometres behind me is the city of Sydney. Now in this kind of terrain, it's even tough for a 4-wheel drive vehicle. It would probably be easier by plane. didn't have one of those, but he did have Gogi. Borrelia had a level head on his young shoulders, and he set out on his expeditions well prepared. He had a crew of 4 New South Wales corps, 5 convicts, and of course his Aboriginal guide Gogi, along with his wife and children. He also made sure he was organised for supplies. 200 years ago, on the 6th of November 1802, Borrelia crossed the Nepean River at Bahini Ford for what was to become a remarkable journey. As he continued on his way, Borrelia reported the rivers and swamps teeming with enormous eels, fish and freshwater shellfish. He saw signs of the many Aboriginal people that inhabited the area. Along the way, Gogi introduced Borrelia to some of the local inhabitants, whom Borrelia called mountaineers. He met up with a fellow called Bungan, and also Wugulmai, Bulgan and Wallara. Thanks to Gogi, young Frank soon had a large contingent of locals happy to share their fires with him. Gogi was proving to be quite an asset. Borrelia was impressed with the amount of game that he saw and realised that the Aboriginal people had a bountiful and varied food supply.
The hills are covered with kangaroos which resemble a flock of goats grazing peacefully and offer to the eye a pleasing pastoral picture.
Borrelia was in wonder of the majesty and grandeur of the landscape, which was starting to become more rugged. He was beginning to doubt if he was going to be able to continue. But being the very determined fellow he was, he crossed a waterfall on the Natai River and headed north.
The mountains are generally accessible up to a certain height, but at an altitude of 1/4 of a mile, they are perpendicular, and their summit forms a kind of leaden wall. The plain seems to be very fertile. When I happen to reach some large trees, I glance at the plain from that great height with a feeling of admiration mingled with awe.
Borrelia continued his journey in order to find a passage between the mountains to the west. He decided to do a survey of the surrounding areas from one of those peaks.
My attention was attracted by a mountain which, although very high, appeared to me rather easy of access. I resolved to ascend. I climbed easily enough for the first half an hour, allured by the singing pheasants. I met with soil without consistency like fine sand, interspersed with large and very sharp-edged stones.
Borrelia made it about 3/4 of the way up fairly easily, but then his passage was hindered by immense overhanging rocks, which in his words seemed to be attached to nothing and offered an appalling scene. At the slightest touch, they gave way and rolled down the hill.
I continued my advance in that dangerous situation for half an hour, using my hands as well as my feet, which were bleeding.
Borrelia didn't make it to the summit, but he did make it high enough to see he could travel another 50 kilometres without obstacles. And so he continued west toward the far side of the mountains. His luck was holding, but young Frank needed more than that. He needed the help of the local mountain people, the Gundungurra, who knew this country better than anyone else alive, and no one more than their senior statesman and chief named Gundul.
When I arrived at the top of one of the hills which formed the base of the mountain, Bungin the mountaineer saw a fire. Round it were seated some natives who rose and put themselves on the defensive. He told them not to be frightened and that we were traveling without any intention of doing them any harm.
The Gundungurra chief Gundul was there. Another among the group was Mutik, who was the only one who could give Borrelia any information about the way to the other side of the mountain. Was Gundel the king of the mountain that he sought? But Gogi was an Aboriginal man from the inner Sydney region. This here was not Gogi's country, and it seems he wasn't all that well liked by the local Gundungurra mob either.
Gogi, the native in my service, went near the mountaineers and held my gun in his hands to show them that he could make use of our arms. But nobody paid any attention to him. The others from time to time threw terrible glances at him, biting their lips, which did not augur very well for him, and made him aware of the danger.
Just when young Francis Borrelia seemed to have the break he needed, Gogi nervously approached him.
If I had any consideration for him, I would go back. He was certain, he said, that if I spent the night on this spot, Gundel and his party would kill him.
Torn between success and friendship, Borrelia reluctantly left. But what Borrelia didn't know, Gogi had caused trouble with Gundel's people a few years earlier. It seemed that when the crunch came, Gogi was not the asset Borrelia had thought him to be. So if young Frank was to succeed, he would have to do it on his own. To cross the Blue Mountains was a major feat for the Europeans of the day. Despite many efforts over many years, it was still proving an impossible task. But to the local Aboriginal people, it was just part of everyday life, crossing along established trading routes which had existed for many generations. Usually their only maps were stories featuring the landscape along the way. Tribes traded items such as ceremonial ochre and shells, tools and stone. They travelled light, finding food and shelter along the way. This is the Great Western Highway. This road was pretty much all built along the path taken by those first explorers, Blaxland, Lawson and Wentworth, who had themselves, probably by chance, simply followed the trade routes across the mountains that the Aboriginal people had used for thousands of years. Remember what I said about Borrelia being good at drawing maps? Well, he was not the first person to map the mountains. This rock map here was done many years before Borrelia's time. The map represents the creeks and rivers in the valley below, and even shows a camping area and where game could be found. As a point along the trade route, the place where Lithgow is now was a good place to stop for people travelling through. The route was well used by the Wiradjuri, Gundungurra, Darkinjung and most likely the Darug people. The route itself crossed over the mountains to the Nunes Plateau and down to a place called Waratah Ridge. This is where I've asked local Bob Suda to show me a very significant and ancient cave which, for the local Aboriginal people, denoted the end of their journey over the mountains.
Well, Frank, this is Blackfell's Hands, just north of Lithgow, and I love this place. You can see there's some artwork here, hand stencils, all different sizes too. This is where they would have brought in their children, stenciled their hands against the wall, and that was part of the handing over the guardianship of the land. And also it keeps a record every time they come back. They'd place their handprint on the wall again to see how much they've grown as well. As you can see, there's an extensive range of art here. We've got stone axe, we've got a doll painting there as well, boomerang, and You'll see hands down, right down the end there, and they've got red ochre around the hands, which means they would have come down from another area or be under a different law. And like you can see, this place is fairly well covered, plenty of shelter, food and water in the area, so it would have been an ideal place to camp. This area here as well was the end of the trail over the mountains, coming down from Waratah Ridge, off the Newlands Plateau, down this way. It would have been an easier trek. And after a long trek through the mountains, this place would be ideal to getting out of the elements, especially in winter time. The way the overhang faces, it's out of the westerly winds that come through here in winter, which are like well below zero temperatures, so with a fire going in here you would have been quite warm.
After their stay in the Lithgow area, which was an important gathering place for people from all over, some of the travellers continued their journey further on to the west, which is also the way we're heading now. The Great Western Highway extends all the way through the Blue Mountains, to the Central Tablelands and further on to the Western Plains. Just over there is the original route taken by surveyor George Evans. Way back in December 1813, only 6 months after Blackstone, Lawson and Wentworth finally made it over the mountains, Evans continued on and found the Bathurst Plains. He was so impressed with what he saw, he stated, "The increase of stock for some 100 years cannot overrun it." This is the spot here where he first saw the plains. He climbed up these rocks, and from the top he could see all the way to Mount Panorama. And being a modest sort of a bloke, he named this rocky outcrop Evans Crown, after himself, of course.
Dreamtime woman, you were there.
To the Aboriginal people of this area, it has a very special significance.
You're everywhere, with your dark skin glistening in the sun.
We've now well and truly crossed the Blue Mountains and arrived in Bathurst, the first settlement to be established inland. Bathurst was proclaimed a town by Governor Lachlan Macquarie on the 7th of May 1815, and every year the city celebrates its proclamation day.
I now name this town Bathurst, in honour of the Secretary of State for the Colonies, the 3rd Earl of Bathurst.
Bathurst was not an easy birth. It has quite a bloody history, which we'll find out about shortly. That's where we're headed, to get a good look at what was so attractive about this district and why it was fought for so heavily. Since 1938, Mount Panorama has been the home to a new tribe. That's where we've just come from. Geologists claim that geological forces created the Great Dividing Range, pushing up two plateaus, one coming from the direction of Sydney across to the west, and one holds Katoomba with the famous Three Sisters and those other places. Then we've got Bell's line of road, with places like Bilpin, Apple Country. Happened to buy one on the way up. The Aboriginal nation in this area is the Wiradjuri, And Mount Panorama held a special ceremonial significance for the Wiradjuri people. And Mount Stewart over there is considered by the local Wiradjuri as the most sacred ceremonial site in this area. The site contains many artefacts known to belong to secret business. My friend Bill Allen, one of the local Wiradjuri people and an officer with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, will be able to tell us more about this area.
Frank?
How you going, Bill?
Not too bad. Good
to see you.
Hey.
Bill, what can you tell me about Evans Crown and the mountains of this area around here?
Well, Evans Crown was a very important initiation and a site for both men and women. But it wasn't just for Wiradjuri people. It was where you had the Gundungurra, the Durrig, sometimes even Kamilaroi, and some of the Yuin people down the south coast used to come there for ceremony. And so once they finished doing ceremonies out there, they continued on to a place just outside Bathurst where the junction of the river starts, and that's where some continuation of marriage, some initiation and that sort of thing that took place, and also renewal of kinships with the people, and then continued on further up to Mount Panorama, or Walu as we call it in the Wiradjuri language, and then continuing on to another place called Stewart's Mount, which is basically almost the finishing of the ceremony that starts off at Evans Crown for the Wiradjuri people from this area anyway.
This fertile area west of the Great Dividing Range is fed by three rivers, isn't it? The Macquarie, which is known as the Womble.
Yes.
The Lachlan, which is known as the Clare.
Well, people pronounce it as Clare today, but it's the pronunciation is Kalari.
Kalari, and that's down towards the west, out this way?
From around, starts off around Burra and goes out through Cowra, Forbes, Condobolin, and further west.
And of course then there's the magnificent Murrumbidgee, isn't there?
Yep, or Murrumbidgee is the other pronunciation, Wiradjuri pronunciation, which the Kalari actually joins up with further down. The three rivers actually is, I suppose, which identifies the Wiradjuri people. We're known as the people of the three rivers, and the other thing with our people is that we're known as the people that go from the mountains to the rivers to the plains, because it starts off in the mountains and then ends up out in the flat country further west.
So from a European point of view, the area here at Bathurst along the riverfront would have been a prized area for farming, I'd imagine.
Oh yes, it would have been. That's the reason why they picked this area, because as they come down from the mountains, they seen it was fairly open country because of open woodland. You had your nice she oaks and river oaks along the rivers, which gave pretty good shade and all that sort of things, and all the wildlife along there. But like saying, nice country to sort of grow, sort of town up and use some of the river flat to grow your vegetables and things like that. So yeah, when Evans came out, done his surveying, that's what he went back and told them back in Sydney. So that's when people started coming out this way around after about 1815 and settled.
For a good while, the Aboriginal people and the Europeans lived together more or less peacefully. But competing for this area had its eventual consequences.
Frank.
And it was this that led to war. The beginning years of Bathurst were peaceful, and for a long time relations between the Wiradjuri and the many free settlers that came to the district were friendly and hospitable. But this situation, unfortunately, didn't last. Sparks of tension finally flamed into full-scale war over what historians say was a tragic misunderstanding at a potato farm in nearby Kelso. A farmer, thinking he was helping some of the less fortunate natives, gave them some potatoes from his farm. The Aborigines thought that this meant that they could help themselves whenever they needed them. After all, it was food growing on their traditional lands. When they returned and took more potatoes, the farm accused them of stealing. Shots were fired, and several of the Aborigines were killed.
So after all the sparks of skirmishes which were going on around the district, this was the one that actually flared up. From that point onwards, there were retaliations. It flared up into a full-scale war between the Europeans and between the Wiradjuri. It was a war of such bloody proportions. It basically meant that it was almost wholesale slaughter. There were women and children killed. There were also instances where waterholes were poisoned, and these are in non-Aboriginal records.
Suzanne Ingram is a descendant of the Wiradjuri and has been working over the last few years researching the history of the conflicts for a feature film. The movie will be on the life of Windradyne, the leader of the Wiradjuri people during the Bathurst War.
Windradyne impressed a lot of people, there's absolutely no doubt about that. There's lots and lots and lots of descriptions of him physically, but the ones which kept on getting repeated, of course, were that he was powerfully built, he was very muscular, definitely he was, you know, this wonderful male specimen. There was also one which quoted him as being of noble appearance and piercing of eye. But that does not take away the fact that he was an absolutely extraordinarily intelligent man, and also extremely fearsome and courageous. Part of his job also was to not only wage this war, but also to gather the troops, i.e. the Wiradjuri troops. But at the same time, he was also responsible, and his deputies and his lieutenants were responsible for the protection and the continued protection of women and children, and particularly the old people. Once you've lost the old people, then you've lost a lot of the stories, and there's no doubt that Windradyne cared very, very much about his people, about his nation.
Wiradjuri warriors began systematically attacking outlying stations, destroying buildings and livestock and killing the occupants. The conflict escalated, and the government responded by sending in more troops. By the middle of 1824, around 20 white people had been killed, and around 100 Aboriginal people, including Windradyne's own family. At the height of the conflict, there were many reprisals against the early settlers who had established themselves on traditional Wiradjuri land.
There was a war party which was organised in the middle of the night. The Sutters had their hut on Brucedale. Windradyne had organised a raiding party, and they were all painted up, and I could not imagine anything more frightening than a powerfully built Aboriginal warrior painted up for war with a number of other warriors who are trained to kill with absolute accuracy, which is what Windradyne was now renowned for. His accuracy with the spear was unquestioned. Would have been a most frightening sight. And William Sutter came out and he met Windradyne and the war party.
There is no doubt that the intention was to kill the Sutters in reprisal for the many Wiradjuri deaths. But the outcome was incredible, and the Sutters, well, their descendants live to tell the tale still.
My great-great-grandfather, George Sutter, arrived in Sydney in 1800, and stories were coming back about this wonderful country west of the Blue Mountains. And he got permission to cross the mountains in 1822. He thought he was coming to a 2,000-acre grant at a point where a compass line drawn west of Bathurst crosses the Macquarie River. But of course the Macquarie River runs north of Bathurst, so this 2,000 acres didn't really exist. However, they did apparently settle at the western end of the river plain for about a year. But by this time they had befriended some of the local Wiradjuri tribe and told them about an area about 10 miles to the north of Bathurst, and he was given a grant of 320 acres at this point. He had his three sons with him, one of whom was William Henry. He was a young man of 17 at the time, and must have realised that there had to be a coexistence between the Aboriginals and the white settlers, and I think much to his credit he set about learning the Wiradjuri language, and as far as we know he was the only young white settler who bothered to do so. Well, here we are. This is the old hut where Windradine's war party came to, well, we assume to massacre the family. Now, William Henry was a strapping young man, 6 feet or so. Windradine the same. He was apparently a very fine specimen of manhood, and I like to imagine here these two young warriors of their respective tribes eyeballing one another and able to talk in the local Wiradjuri language. It must have been a fair surprise to Windradine to actually meet a young white settler who spoke his language. And this apparently diffused the situation, and Windradine's war party left and left the family alone.
I think the interesting thing is that just by virtue of one European man bothering to get to know the people of this land, literally saved his life. So maybe we can take a few things from that.
By August 1824, the situation got out of control and martial law was imposed. This was the only time in Australian history that martial law had been declared. The Battle of Bathurst began on the 18th of September 1824 with 75 troops and over 100 armed auxiliaries. They massacred hundreds of Wiradjuri men, women and children, systematically destroying their camps, their weapons, their dogs, their utensils. They destroyed everything.
There came a point when enough was enough. You could not possibly lose so many generations, and particularly future generations of Wiradjuri people, by allowing this war to go on. And it's well recorded, Windradine gathering the remainder of the Wiradjuri people, and they walked, I think it took them 3 days to walk from Bathurst to Parramatta and meet with the governor. And evidently Windradine had a hat on with a card with the word peace written on it, and that's how he finished it. He finished martial law with that act. So all in all, despite his courageous campaigning and resistance fight, Windradine met an undistinguished end. He, after taking the Wiradjuri nation to meet Governor Brisbane in Parramatta, he returned to Bathurst and was involved in what was referred to as a tribal skirmish. He was injured in the leg and received a wound which he eventually did die of. They say that he was buried in the grounds of Bathurst Base Hospital, but the Sutters believe he's buried on Brucedale.
Frank, this is where we believe that Windradine is buried, and we believe so because great-grandfather had struck up a good relationship with Windradine and the Wiradjuri, and his son actually wrote the story and says, yes, well, this is where Windradine is buried. Well, this is Windradine's grave, and we thought that this area should be conserved.
John, I believe that you've entered into some kind of an agreement to deal with land heritage.
Yes, some years ago my son David made first approaches to the National Parks and Wildlife Service as to perhaps what we could do to conserve this area, and the upshot of that was we have entered into a voluntary conservation agreement, which means that this area is now protected and conserved for all time.
A voluntary conservation agreement is with the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service, who help landowners with managing significant Aboriginal sites on their properties. The National Parks and Wildlife Service can take care of the costs of preserving this heritage. Often a barrier for many landowners who would like to protect these places, but for many reasons find it difficult to do. The sites are examined by the local Aboriginal Sites Officer, who in this area just happens to be a familiar face. You know, Bill, most Australians would like to see Aboriginal sites maintained because there's incredible history around here.
Yep.
And I believe that no one's under any obligation, that all agreements are negotiated directly with the landowners. Is that true?
Yes, that's right, Frank. It's a voluntary conservation agreement where the landholder basically wants to conserve some particular part of their property that might have some value. With this one, John's family approached us and we went in and that way for its cultural significance of being a very important burial of a very important person within the Wiradjuri people, and he's still sort of seen as a hero to the Wiradjuri people today.
The other landowners then, if they identify a spot, they're a bit worried then that the Aboriginal people will come in and make a big claim or something. Is that true?
The private landholders, that they have this fear that because they have an Aboriginal site that the land claim can be put over their property and the Aboriginal people will come and just take the land just like that, which is so far from the truth that, you know, sometimes it makes you want to laugh. But some of these people have fed these things and they believe it, and until you actually sit down and point things out to them from an Aboriginal perspective on how we view the land and how we view the sites, some of them understand. And in a way, with some landholders and that too, that they view themselves as being the caretakers of the land today.
So does that mean then that anyone can just drive in on my property and visit the sites? Have I got any control?
Well, part of the agreement, and as with what happened with John's family, was that the local land council and some of the Wiradjuri people involved in the discussions, and it was agreed in the drawing up of the plan. It was agreed that access be given to the Aboriginal people, but that didn't mean that they can just come out any time they wanted to. A bit of courtesy to John's family and just a phone call, at least 24 hours, and just to ask, just check to see if it's all right to come out. And that's the relationship we've got with John's family, and we haven't had any problems with him.
Sounds good to me.
That's, it's good. We've built up a really strong relationship with the Starr family since we've had this agreement with them.
The National Parks and Wildlife Service has a comprehensive database register of significant sites throughout New South Wales. Something like 40,000 sections covering story sites, ceremonial digs, and other places of interest, as well as movable pieces like artefacts, tools, even tree trunks. John, the Sutters certainly have some interesting stories in their family history. What about the one hiding the largest gold nugget ever found?
Yes, well, that's a great legend. Frank, come on in and I'll tell you the story. My great-grandfather's brother-in-law, Dr. Kerr, had a sheep station at Wallawar, where Hargraves is now, and he employed 3 Aboriginal shepherds, one who was called Jemmy Irving. And he was out with the sheep one day and saw this outcrop of rock, turned it over and thought that was gold. So he went and told the doctor, who came and looked at the mass and, yes, said it was gold. And so it was eventually packed up and brought here to Brucedale.
Now, this chunk of gold was found 21 years before the famous Byers and Halterman nugget. Actually, it weighed in at 106 pounds. So that made it the largest nugget of gold ever found in Australia up to that point. But John, this piece of gold was never officially recorded as the largest in the world. Why is that?
Well, when it was taken back to Dr. Kerr's homestead, it was broken up so as they could put it in their saddlebags, and it was to avoid being robbed and drawing any attention to themselves. The gold was brought to Brucedale and put in this cupboard. And of course they later regretted having broken it up.
I was just checking, John, to see if there was a little piece left over there for me, but there's nothing there. Gold. During the 1800s, the area around Bathurst was overrun with prospectors. At this time, there was only about 50 more people living in Sydney than were out here, all searching for the glint in the ground that would probably change their lives forever. For the Aboriginal people, there was no real purpose for this stuff. They didn't use it for their weapons. They didn't even use it for making tools. But it didn't take them very long to figure out that they could use this funny looking yellow stuff for their trade. It's been said that Aboriginal people were very good at finding gold because they knew the country so well. Apparently, the women were especially good at spotting it. Some people have all the luck. With so much focus on the gold, little has been recorded about the land itself. And because the Turon River flows through these beautiful and stunning mountain ranges, it is one of the fastest flowing rivers in the southern hemisphere. As the water drops, it falls 300 millimetres every kilometre for over 104 kilometres. That's 31,200 millimetres, give or take a millimetre or two. So river country, what does that mean? In Australia, one of the driest continents on the earth. Well, we Aussies, when we have water, we certainly know what to do with it. For the Wiradjuri, the river people, these watercourses were the best way for them to travel, either by bark canoe or by walking along the riverbanks. These ranges hide a number of caves, good for shelter. A conservative guess, maybe about 1,000, maybe more. No one really knows. For the local Aboriginal people, places were named after the things you need. That peak up there was called Power, which in Wiradjuri means small swamp wallaby. The European settlers, however, often named places to remind them of their homeland, like Newcastle, Innisfail, Fremantle, or even after people like Bathurst, Brisbane or Macquarie. But way back in 1828, Surveyor General Thomas Mitchell laid down a set of principles that accorded official preference to Indigenous place names. This was reinforced at the International Provincial Geographical Conference in 1884 and again in 1912 by a meeting of the Australasian Surveyors General. In December 1993, the Geographical Names Board of New South Wales, which is actually located in Bathurst, was persuaded by the New South Wales Lands Council to adopt a dual naming policy for geographical features, and eventually reverting back to Aboriginal names. The Geographic Names Board is considering Dawes Point, the area situated under the city side of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, as the first geographical feature in New South Wales to also carry its traditional Aboriginal name, Tara. Mr. Kim Yaden, Minister for Information and Technology, is the New South Wales Minister responsible for the Geographic Names Board.
Dual naming is a policy that the New South Wales Government has introduced as part of its approach to reconciliation. It is about giving Aboriginal names alongside European names to geographical features, and that's all it applies to is geographical features. It's not suburbs or towns or roads, you know, those types of names. We have a committee that's set up, a subcommittee under the Geographical Names Board that is going through this process, and of course we're relying very much on the Indigenous community to give us information on pronunciation and the accuracy of some of the names, because as Indigenous history is by and large verbal, we have to go back and do that work because it's often not, you know, recorded in writing or anything around the place. There's been very successful approach with it in the Northern Territory with Uluru and Ayers Rock, and it's great to see over time that Ayers Rock has now become Uluru. You very rarely hear people call it Ayers Rock, and I think that's one of the things that we can see in New South Wales over time, places that will revert back to their original Aboriginal name, the same as we've seen it in the Northern Territory with Uluru, and I think that'd be a great thing. Of course, where we are here underneath the harbour bridge was originally the country of the Cadigal people. The first place to be nominated is here at Dawes Point. I think that's very, very symbolic for the process, because Dawes Point is one of the earliest geographical areas of European settlement. Lieutenant Dawes, who was the official surveyor on the First Fleet, was also an amateur astronomer, and he came down and set up his observatory here in 1788 through to 1791. I think it's just terrific that we're now just about concluded the process here for Dawes Point to also receive its Aboriginal name, which is Tara. It's a great way, I think, to re-establish, particularly for young Aboriginal people, a connection with their culture and with their past, and also that everybody in the community can understand that and celebrate it as well.
Should the Geographical Names Board eventually approve the dual naming of Dawes Point, the two names could be displayed prominently at the forecourt entrance to the reserve. They could also be used in all future written material produced about the site, such as maps, brochures and books. The English name would appear first, followed by the Cadigal name, Tara, in italics.
I don't think that Lieutenant Dawes would have objected to this dual naming policy, because in fact he was one of the first people to engage with the Aboriginal people and undertake anthropological studies with them, and indeed record some of their languages. And he is the recorder of some of the first Aboriginal names that we ever have in English.
Now, what has Dawes Point got to do with our hero, Francis Borrelia? You remember how I told you he was a clever young bloke? Well, he was more than just your average soldier or explorer. You see, he designed our very first fort here at Dawes Point. Work commenced way back in 1804, but it was never completed. Borrelia had more pressing things to do, and the governor decided that it was no longer needed. So just where did young Frank get to in his travels?
Well, there are various theories as to where Borrelia actually got to. He started off from Parramatta, got to the Natai, where he made a depot, and that far he got with a bullock dray. From there he walked, and he walked with his Aboriginal guides and his soldiers, and he got to, we think, somewhere around about Urandri. It is my theory also that he actually climbed Urandri Peak. The Urandri Peak is a very tall peak, and it would be the logical place to climb and see what is over on the other side of the mountains if you were trying to get across. And it's my theory that he went through either the Tenali Gap or the gap close to it called the Cowmung Gap. Where he got from there, we think he went as far as Christie's Creek, which is where there are some waterfalls, because in his journal he says that there are waterfalls and they stopped him.
Val Lewedi, author and historian, owns Urandri Private Town. It was once a thriving mining community, full of people searching for that other precious metal, silver. Val Lewedi has spent many years researching the life of Francis Borrelia and the Aborigines of the region.
The Aboriginal people of this area, as Borrelia described them, were a very good-looking group. They had long hair, they wore skin cloaks. The people themselves spread through the whole of this mountain area. They were nomads. They probably were not here all the time because they followed the feed. If there were special flowers or game, they would follow that. The Burragorang Valley itself was full of game. The Gundungurra people, who probably lived here for 50,000 years or so, didn't last very long when the white people came, and they kicked the Aboriginal people off their tribal lands. By 1871, there was a man here called Harold Clyde Manning, and he got two of his half-caste Aboriginal people to dig some post holes for a fence. These two were William Russell, or Werryberry, and another man called Billy George. And these two friends actually dug holes and found silver in Urandri. Willie Russell was a very interesting man in his own right, and he died in 1914, and he was the last so-called chief of the Gundungurra people. He is buried, or at least he's got a gravestone, whether he's actually buried there or not I don't know, in the Corder Road Cemetery at Camden, and it's a most unusual gravestone. It looks like the stump of a tree, and it's got a cross on the top because he was a Christian and a white man, but he was also an Aborigine, and it has an unusual insignia on the base of the what was the stone, gravestone or tree, and it looks like a couple of chevrons, and it was the type of insignia that the Aboriginal people of this area had.
The main access from Sydney to Urandri was once along the Burragorang Valley, along a similar route that Francis Borrelia took on his expeditions. The silver, which was mined here, was transported to Camden, only 65 kilometres away, by horse and cart or bullock wagon. Declining production, falling silver prices, difficult access and a crippling strike spelt the end for the mines. In the 1950s, the building of Warragamba Dam to form Lake Burragorang meant the only access to Urandri from Sydney was via Oberon, a distance of over 300 kilometres by road.
Today Urandri is, well, I call it a ghost town. It was a ghost town. For 10 years nobody lived here at all. Once the mining ceased, few people stayed, and then the water board flooded the valley and cut our access to Camden, and eventually I bought out a company which owned the area, an old mining company, and I've been restoring the buildings one by one ever since for the last 30 years, and people come from all over the world to find it because it's quite a unique spot.
Well, it looks like we can't get much further through here, and neither did Borrelia. But if he had just gone south of Urandri Peak instead of north, it would have been an easy stroll across the rest of the way. And Borrelia's journey would have altered the course of Australian history.
Had he got over the mountains there, then yes, he would have been before Wentworth, Flaxland and Lawson, who didn't get over the mountains until 11 years later, and even they didn't get over the mountains. It was Evans, the surveyor, who actually got over the mountains.
Because Gogi made it impossible for Borrelia to get instructions from Goondal, it made it difficult. And Borrelia's men refused to go on because the harsh terrain had worn out their boots, thus ending Borrelia's attempt to cross the Blue Mountains at the daunting Christie's Falls. And, well, my old mate Frank.
I was hopeful of being more successful in another journey, which I was contemplating to undertake towards the west, starting from Jarvis Bay.
Nali